subsidies to carry out certain operations which may not be economically viable, because as a part of the social mandate given to the railways, they are often required to provide connectivity to far-flung areas, and where the cost of providing the network is far above the revenues that this connectivity or these routes generate for Indian Railways. So in the interest of providing connectivity to far-flung areas, the government may decide to give a lump sum subsidy to railways. The important point is that why we call this as a production subsidy, because the lump sum amount which is given to railways is not depending on how much of passenger traffic that the railways provided in those specified localities, but rather it is a lump sum amount which is to take care of their overall expenses. Likewise, sometimes government makes use of the vast network of credit cooperatives at the village level, which are known as the primary agricultural credit societies, to facilitate adoption of certain agricultural practices. Maybe government wants that a particular fertilizer which is good for the productivity of a particular agricultural crop, that the farmers should adopt in the interest of overall national food security. Now it is difficult to reach out to the farmers in far-flung areas. Again, government can ask the primary agricultural credit societies to undertake the function of providing fertilizer at their doorstep to the farmers through the cooperatives. Now this involves cost, and because the primary agricultural credit society function is to lend money to its members rather than working as an outlet for distribution of fertilizer, but they do it under the instruction of government, and government, because of this additional burden, decide to provide them a lump sum amount as a subsidy. So these are examples of production subsidy. There are so many government departments which carry out one function or the other which government feels is socially relevant and needs to be supported, and to help them, government provides a lump sum amount in the budget. These are to be seen as different from the product subsidies. Product subsidy like the food subsidy, the fertilizer subsidy. Food subsidy is given to the Food Corporation of India. The fertilizer subsidy is given to the fertilizer companies. This subsidy will depend on how much food grains were actually given to the people, or how much of fertilizer were actually sold by the fertilizer manufacturing companies. And unlike the production subsidy, it is not a lump sum amount. It depends on the unit of goods that is transacted. Now, as I said, instances of product taxes, product subsidies could be food, petroleum, fertilizer subsidies, and of course sometimes interest subsidies are given to farmers. As you might be knowing that the lending to farmers for cultivation purposes is regulated in India. Farmers are provided loans at 7% interest rate, but sometimes for timely repayment, the central government gives a 2% additional concession, and or which is called as an interest subsidy. Now the amount of interest subsidy will again depend on how much of loans have been availed by a particular farmer. So in that context, they depend on how much of loans are availed, rather than it is a lump sum amount. Now let us look at the product taxes. We have discussed about production taxes. Production taxes were independent of the volume of production. It was like a license fee or a registration fee. But unlike production tax, product taxes are levied on the unit of goods sold or unit of goods produced. Instances of product taxes are abound. The value-added tax, which was introduced from July 1st, 2017, is an example of a product tax. Now, having discussed product tax, production tax, product subsidy, and production subsidy, we will now look into the various concepts which have been introduced when the GDP base year was changed to 2011-12. How they are relevant, the concept of production tax and production subsidy. If you see, a new concept of GDP or a new measure of GDP has been given, which is the GVA at basic price, which is nothing but the GVA at factor cost plus production taxes minus production subsidies. GVA at factor cost is nothing but the in the previous base what was known as the GDP at factor cost. Now in the 2011-12 base, we are using a new nomenclature as the GVA at factor cost. Now GVA at factor cost, from the first equation we can, by rearranging, we can find that it is the GVA at basic price minus production tax plus production subsidies. Now the third concept is the GDP at market price, which is nothing but the GVA at basic price plus product taxes minus product subsidies. So if we ignore the second point, the first concept is GVA at basic price, and I'm going to the GDP at market price from GVA at basic price by adding the product taxes and subtracting the product subsidies. So I hope you are able to see the distinction between the production tax and production subsidy. I'm sure in our discussion on production tax and product tax and production subsidy versus vis-a-vis product subsidy will be handy to appreciate the difference between the measures of GDP. This is what is the definition part of it, but what is the intuition behind, or is there any way we can conceptualize these various measures of GDP as per the new methodology? One way to look at it would be, or rather the way I look at it is, the GDP at factor cost, which we now call as the GVA at factor cost, is nothing but payment to all factors of production excluding government. Now in this concept we don't use any form of tax or subsidies for adjustment. Now just like we said, payments to various factors of production, what those factors were: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. Now suppose I add as another factor, which is government, which helps to facilitate production. Now if we consider government as another entity or as another factor of production, now if we exclude government, you will get the GDP at factor cost. Now we can introduce government in the two other concepts that we have discussed, which is the GVA at basic price. The GVA at basic price is nothing but GVA at factor cost plus production tax minus production subsidy. That means we will make a transition from GDP at factor cost or GVA at factor cost to GVA at basic price by introducing government in two stages. In the first stage, we will introduce production tax and production subsidy. When we adjust the GVA at factor cost by adding the production tax and subtracting the production subsidy, we get the GVA at basic price. Now, as I said, we are introducing government in two steps. In the first step, we talked about the production tax, production subsidy, which were independent of the volume of production. It is like you have to pay these fees or taxes irrespective of how much you want to produce. But in the second stage, we will introduce the product tax and product subsidy, which is also relates to government's revenue. So we will now go to the concept of GDP at market price from GVA at basic price by adding product tax and subtracting product subsidy from the GVA at basic price. So if we retain the previous terms, now we are adding the product tax and product subsidy. I started with GVA at factor cost, which is payment to all factors of production excluding government. Now at basic price, I used this GVA at factor cost, which is payment to all factors of production plus production tax minus production subsidy. And in the third stage, what I am getting is GDP at market price, which is nothing but GVA at basic price, which is payment to all factors of production plus production tax minus production subsidy, but now I am adding the product tax and subtracting product subsidy. So if you see, the GDP at market price is capturing payment to all factors of production including government. Now if I were to move backwards, suppose I have GDP at market price, how do I get the GVA at basic price? I will just take out the product tax and product subsidy from the GDP at market price, which is nothing but my indirect business taxes, net indirect business taxes, which you have already seen when we discussed about the GDP at market price and GDP at factor cost. Now, if we look at this entire discussion from a different perspective, who is selling the product? The retailer is selling the product to the consumer, but the retailer is getting it from whom? From the wholesaler or the distributor, and the wholesaler is getting it from whom? He is getting it directly from the producer. Now the producer is charging his cost of production, but also he is charging the amount he has paid to the government on production, like license fee, land revenue, stamp duty and registration fee. What we are saying is when the wholesaler is buying the product from the manufacturer, he not only pays for the payments to factors of production but also the payment that is made to the government. But the retailer is collecting the indirect tax or the sales tax or the VAT and is paying it to the government. So when we look at it from the retailer's perspective, the retailer is selling the product to the consumer, the retailer is collecting sales tax